Alrighty, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Dwayne David Paul. I'm the director here at the Collaborative Center for Justice.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel E. Scott. I'm the Associate Director at the Collaborative Center for Justice. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Collaborative Center for Justice, we are an advocacy organization based in Hartford, and we're sponsored by 6 congregations of women religious. And our mission is to advocate for systemic change and educate individuals about social justice issues in order to make a difference in the lives of people that are poor and marginalized. And we carry out our mission through a number of different activities, including organizing a prayer partners program for community members to pray for elected officials, through advocacy and lobbying efforts. We work through community organizing efforts as well, and through educational opportunities.
Thank you, Rachel. And so tonight's conversation is part of the center's educational mission. We share ideas and we build knowledge together, not for its own sake, although that can be really enriching, but rather to build community and to more competently call upon the values of our faith traditions as we work for justice. So in that sense, tonight's program in the series, Public Theology Conversations, right? Public theology isn't a project just for people with specialized training. It is for everyone who wants to marshal their religious commitments or even their curiosities to help build a common good. And so Rachel's going to explain the format for this evening.
So again, we're glad to have you all with us for this conversation. So about the format, we'll begin in a moment with a moderated discussion with Olga Segura for about 20 minutes, and then we will break out into small groups for some conversation. When we return to the larger group, we'll pose a final question to Olga about hope in social justice work. And then finally, we'll talk about one concrete way that you can put your faith into action.
So Olga Segura is currently the opinions editor at the National Catholic Reporter. Before joining NCR, she worked as an associate editor for America magazine. And we're really excited, especially because she is the author of the forthcoming book, Birth of a Movement, Black Lives Matter and the Catholic Church. So we're going to go ahead and sort of dive right into the sort of moderated conversation right now.
All right. So thank you, Olga, for being with us today. To begin our discussion, I have 2 initial questions for you. So what is the moral or religious urgency behind pulling the church into the Black Lives Matter movement? And how is the church implicated in this struggle?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really wonderful question. I first want to begin by thanking Rachel and Dwayne and the rest of the Collaborative Center for Justice for inviting me to be in community with you guys together. I think I always look forward to being in these spaces with other thinkers, so thank you. I think that the moral urgency behind pulling the church into this movement is that people are dying. We are seeing that people are dying, have been dying every single day this year, whether that's at the hands of the global pandemic or at the hands of law enforcement. People are dying, people are suffering, and we cannot claim to be a pro-life church while our leaders remain silent about the movements, organizations, women who are doing the work to call attention to the very real ways that systemic violence has repeatedly killed Black and Indigenous communities in particular since the first colonizers arrived on these lands. And this year alone, we've seen more than 800 people have been killed at the hands of police officers. We know that more than 224,000 citizens in the United States have died due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And we know that a disproportionate amount of those victims have been people from Black and Latino communities. And that the racial capitalism that was born in the United States that caused chattel slavery, that caused systemic violence post-slavery, that violence, that capitalism has shaped every American institution in this country, and it has also shaped the American Catholic Church. We know that in 1452, the Pope at the time issued a papal bull that was used to justify not just colonialism, but the enslavement of marginalized peoples. We know that and I'm very grateful for the work of Black historian Shannon D. Williams, whose scholarship has shown us that the church was involved in chattel slavery even prior to the 1619 year that many of us attribute as the start of enslavement in the United States. And we know that religious orders in the 19th century sold enslaved persons to avoid bankruptcy. We know that in the 20th century, the church, Catholic parishes, Catholic schools were segregated. We know that the church released a 1979 document on racism and would not release another one until 2018 with Open Wide Our Hearts. And we know that in 2020 alone, we see individual bishops, individual church leaders who have perpetuated very racist and misogynistic ideas as Catholic leaders. We know that Cardinal Timothy Dolan of New York just this past summer, he seemed to equate in his piece in, I don't remember what publication, but he equated the oppression that Black Americans have faced in the United States with his perceived oppression, with the perceived oppression he believed the NYPD has been facing as anti-racism protests continue in New York City. And we know that Thomas Daly of Washington, Spokane, another bishop in the USCCB who has denigrated the founders of the movement, who has said that the Black women who founded the Black Lives Matter movement do not care about the violence in cities like Chicago, the usual racist tropes that a lot of white Catholics in our church I've encountered in my reporting. And this is the reality of American Catholicism. This is the context in which our church exists. And we've never had leaders collectively and publicly and consistently grapple with that history. We've never seen our leaders opine on this movement. We've never seen them talk about police brutality. We've never seen them talk about abolition. We've yet to see them really begin to grapple with a lot of the things that we are all as Catholics grappling in 2020. And so that's where the moral urgency is for me, right? If Black and Brown, Indigenous, other communities of color are being disproportionately affected by police violence, by a global pandemic, and our church refuses to explicitly align itself with movements that are calling attention to that, I think that that's where the moral urgency lies. We cannot claim to be a pro-life church while people within the church's communities, a lot of the marginalized communities that are also faithful, while these communities are being devastated. So that's where the moral urgency lies.
Thanks so much for that. So we shared, for folks attending, you'll recall that we shared Olga's essay, February 2019 essay, What Black Lives Matter Can Teach Catholics About Racial Justice, as our common text for the evening, and a sort of jumping off point for our sort of small group reflections and as a sort of referent for this conversation. So I saw that because one of the things that you highlight in the essay and that you touched on just now in your answer, was the role of particularly queer Black women in founding Black Lives Matter, but I think overall in leadership in the movement for Black Lives, sort of more broadly, outside of the sort of individual organization of BLM. And so I just want to ask, right, so is this among the things, rather, that Black Lives Matter can teach the Catholic Church? And if so, what's the lesson?
Oh, absolutely. I love telling people that the church has so much to learn from not just the women who founded this movement, but literally every single Black woman in the United States. I think that if we are a church that doesn't ordain women, if we are a church where our leadership is mostly men, mostly celibate, almost all white men, I'm talking about the USCCB again, I think they are very limited in their lived experience when it comes to talking about identity, sexuality, racial justice. And I think that these three founders, their very real lived experiences have so much to teach the church about stepping outside of what they associate as Catholicism in the United States, which is very much when we think about Catholicism as an institutional body in the United States, it's always centered in whiteness. And I think that that is the number one thing that the church can learn from these founders, just how to shift the church away from just centering the experiences of white Catholics. I also think that these women are three organizers who, even before founding the Black Lives Matter movement in 2013, are women who have been organizing since they were teenagers, since they were in their early 20s. These are women with over 10 years of experience and have a lot to teach the church about what it means to organize, what it means to march for immigration rights, against police brutality, for housing rights, et cetera, reproductive justice, whatever. And I think that they have a lot of direct on the ground experience that our church can really, really benefit from. And I just think that we can become a fuller church if we just embrace this movement, because I think in my own personal reporting and in my own personal faith journey, I have learned so much by this movement, just being able to report on this movement. I've been able to be challenged as a writer. I've been able to be challenged as a light-skinned Black immigrant. I've been able to think more deeply about what it means to be someone who believes in the dignity of every person, because this is a movement that is concerned with the dignity of every single person. So I think that this church can also learn how to more authentically embrace human life and dignity by aligning itself with this movement.
Thanks. Can you actually like kind of flesh that out just a little bit more? Like in particular, this sort of question about like, one, you kind of talk about like the church learning like community organizing. I think like in our community organizing work, like that's a thing that kind of comes up, right? The sort of like the political life of like particularly like individual parishes, right? Like the like what it means to belong to a parish and also engage in like public life. And then also this sort of question about a more like robust or like capacious understanding of human dignity, right? And the struggle for human dignity.
Yeah, for sure. So I'll start with the first point you brought up. So again, I know I keep saying like in my own experience and in my own reporting, but that's what informs a lot of the words that I bring to these events. And just in my own experience, when I first started writing about this movement in 2014, I thought that Catholicism was very theological. And I thought that, and not that that was a bad thing, but I was very caught up in the intellectual aspects of Catholicism. And I wanted to be a writer who engaged with church doctrine and who really just sat with that and did nothing else. And then reporting on this movement, I really began to shift my understanding of what it means to be Catholic. And I thought, okay, to be Catholic, you cannot take our Catholic identity away from social justice, away from trying to help people think more broadly about these movements. And so it inspired me to get more involved, but it also gave me the humility to know, hey, this is the first time I'm doing this work. I know nothing about organizing. I know nothing about what it means to actively work toward defunding the police. And I think that's okay. I think that it is okay for Catholics to also say like, hey, we have no idea what we're doing. Let's learn from the resources that these women are giving us. Let's learn from their mission statement. Let's learn from what these individual organizers and other people involved in the movement and other racial justice movements more broadly, let's learn from the work that they're doing. And I think a lot of people in the church don't want to humble themselves and don't want to acknowledge that they don't know what they're doing. They don't know what it is to do that work, especially a lot of our leadership. I think that they're so far removed from the reality of people on the ground, of a lot of these communities, that I think that's what they can learn. I think that they can learn that you can get involved at any step, no matter where you are in your faith, no matter where you are in this country, and start to deconstruct and decolonize your faith, decolonize your mind. And that can begin with just reading. That can begin with challenging your local priest to talk more fully about Black Lives Matter at the pulpit, whatever that can look like, but just encouraging people. I think that the movement can really encourage Catholics, especially to get creative about what that kind of work can look like, right? Catholics, we love talking about the Catholic imagination and envisioning God in a variety of different ways. And I think that that's one of the ways that this movement can help the church also to think about new ways to be in community, new ways to accompany one another. And I rambled on for so long that I forgot your second point, Dwayne. So if you could just remind me.
No, well, it was also just about like that sort of like fuller picture of dignity that you sort of, the pursuit of dignity that you touched on.
Oh, right. Yes, thank you. So I think often when the institutional church, when a lot of people in Christian media spaces and just public Catholics more broadly, when we talk about what it means to be pro-life, it's often very much only related to reproductive justice. And I think this movement has really challenged a lot of Americans and a lot of people in the church to begin to say, hey, abolition is a pro-life issue. Defunding the police, reforming the police, this is a pro-life issue, right? Thinking about anti-capitalism is a pro-life issue, or all of these things that many of us are encountering for the first time, right? Like, this movement is encouraging to reimagine what it means to be pro-life, right? Because a year ago, I would never have been comfortable saying that Catholics should engage with anti-capitalist work. But again, this movement and also writing this book in the middle of the devastation that is 2020 has really made me sort of open my eyes and think, okay, if this is a system that is happening, if this capitalist system has happened and continues to exploit people, then how can we reconcile that with a faith that challenges us to be centered in love and solidarity, right? So I think that those are some of the ways that it's helped me to reimagine what it means to be a pro-life person.
Great, thank you so much for expanding on that. So now just want to shift a little bit, and we're wondering if you could share an excerpt from your new book that has been especially meaningful for you lately. And maybe after that, kind of just talking to us a little bit about why that particular part is significant to you right now, especially.
Sure. So should I just read from the chapter? Is that okay?
Yeah, however you want to do it.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah,
so let me
you.
just. Okay, so this is from my first chapter, and this is describing a protest that I attended in 2015 with Enoch, who is my fiance, but at the time was just my friend. So I'll start from there. On April 29th, I joined my friend Enoch, who years later became my fiance, and hundreds of marchers as we walked and chanted from Union Square to 42nd Street in Manhattan. Later that evening, as the march continued past 42nd Street, Enoch was arrested. I remember the way my heart stopped as I watched him being pulled into a police van. I feared for his life and wondered whether he or any of the other individuals arrested that night would be the next victim of police brutality. I remember approaching a nearby police officer and asking where I could find my friend. She shrugged and answered, "Not my problem." I remember the urge to grab her or any nearby officer. Activists held me back. They said it would not help me or my friend if I too got arrested. Now, this was not my first interaction with the NYPD. Like many non-white citizens, our coming-of-age stories are always informed by our interactions with law enforcement. From the first time my sister Pamela and I were followed in pharmacies as children, to the night our father, the safest driver we know, was pulled over on our way home from a family dinner. The night of Enoch's arrest, however, I witnessed for the first time the power that American police officers are allowed to possess, one which allows them to control, assault, and kill people of color in public spaces. I also knew that what I saw was nothing compared to the violence activists experienced the previous year during the Ferguson Rebellion, a violence that many white Americans would experience for the first time during the anti-racism protests of 2020, when footage of police brutality against white mothers and veterans who were standing in solidarity with Black Lives Matter erupted on social media. So that's an excerpt from my first chapter. And I think the reason why I chose that chapter or that excerpt and why it's so significant for me is that a lot changed about the book. The original outline of the book has changed, and so many different things about the book have changed, but several things have stayed the same. And that is the parts where I focused on the very real fear that people of color have of law enforcement in this country has stayed throughout. And 2020, this is a fear that communities of color always live with. But 2020 for me pushed that into I basically spent a lot of time after the book just dealing with my own anxiety and dealing with consistent panic attacks, because I had spent so much time sitting with that and sitting with the very real reality that once work started to open up, my fiance was going to have to drive into Manhattan from the Bronx every day. Once the stores, et cetera, started opening up, my father was going to have to drive all around the city. And the fear of knowing that as tensions are rising, as so much violence from law enforcement is happening in this country, they could also be victims. I would never be able to dictate that. I can never prepare myself for that. And I think that this is not an anomaly that I feel. This is a reality that so many people from my communities feel. And I think that that is an important excerpt to me, especially to read whenever I do events like this, because I think that a lot of white Americans, a lot of white Catholics don't realize how devastating it is to wake up every day as a person of color and know that something could go wrong and you could lose a loved one, whether it's to COVID or because some NYPD officer decides that he wants to be consumed with power, whatever. And those are very real realities. And so that excerpt just really demonstrates the very real exhaustion, mental, spiritual, etc., that people of color have carried with them every single day, but in particular in 2020. So that's why that excerpt is still so significant.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That was really powerful. And